I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cleaning a kitchen, folding laundry, or coming home from work, staring at the clock after a long day. Rosa Martinez had abandoned her dreams long ago. The silence in wealthy homes can be deafening, especially when it's your job to move invisibly through rooms where your presence is both necessary and unwanted. I don't know what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you. In the heart of Chicago, where the autumn wind cuts through glass towers like a blade of ice, the wealthy live in bubbles that money cannot make warm. The downtown district gleams with marble facades and chrome elevators, each floor a testament to accumulated wealth measured in stock portfolios, cryptocurrency investments, and properties scattered across 3 continents. Here, fortunes are built on Wall Street algorithms and Bitcoin transactions that most people can't even pronounce. Here, success is calculated in millions, but happiness remains priceless and elusive. Ethan Whitaker owned a penthouse that could house 20 families, yet he lived alone with his ghosts. At 58, his net worth exceeded $40 million, a fortune built through shrewd investments in tech startups, real estate developments along Lake Michigan, and a diversified portfolio that included everything from gold reserves to emerging market bonds. His financial advisor called him brilliant. His accountant called him lucky. But Ethan knew the truth. Money had become his fortress against a world that had betrayed him too many times. The penthouse stretched across the 42nd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. Persian rugs worth more than most people's annual salaries lay scattered across marble floors that reflected the city's cold November light. The kitchen island was carved from a single piece of granite, equipped with appliances that remained mostly untouched. Every surface gleamed with the sterile perfection of a home that was maintained but never truly lived in. But wealth couldn't silence the memories that haunted Ethan's sleepless nights. 3 years ago, his wife Catherine had left him for his business partner, a betrayal that cost him not just his marriage, but nearly $15 million in assets and investments they had built together. The divorce settlement had been brutal. Half of their joint portfolio, the vacation home in Aspen, and custody arrangements that left him seeing his teenage children, Emma and Michael, only on alternating weekends. The business partner, David Chen, a man Ethan had trusted with his life, had been siphoning funds from their joint ventures for months, using insider information to make cryptocurrency investments that should have been shared profits. The betrayal had left scars deeper than financial loss. Ethan had retreated into his penthouse like a wounded animal, hiring security systems worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, conducting background checks on every person who entered his space. His trust account held enough funds to last several lifetimes, but his capacity for trust had been drained to zero. He conducted business meetings via video conference, managed his investment portfolio through encrypted apps, and ordered groceries through delivery services that never required face-to-face interaction. The few staff members he employed were kept at arm's length. Margaret, his head housekeeper for the past 18 months, was a stern woman in her early 60s who managed the household with military precision. She hired and fired cleaning staff based on reports from a private investigation firm, conducted random searches of employees' belongings, and maintained detailed logs of every person who entered the penthouse. Under her supervision, the home ran like a well-oiled machine, cold, efficient, and utterly devoid of warmth. Emma, now 17, visited every other weekend with the reluctance of someone fulfilling a court-ordered obligation. She spoke in monosyllables, spent most of her time locked in her room texting friends, and regarded her father with a mixture of pity and resentment. Michael, 15, was even more distant, carrying the weight of adolescent anger and confusion about why his family had imploded so spectacularly. Both children had witnessed the ugly divorce proceedings, the shouting matches about asset division, and the bitter arguments about custody arrangements that treated them like financial liabilities to be negotiated. The silence in the penthouse was not peaceful. It was the oppressive quiet of a mausoleum where every footstep echoed against marble walls and every conversation felt forced. Ethan would stand at his windows in the evening, watching the city's lights twinkle like stars he could never reach, calculating his daily investment returns on his phone while trying to ignore the ache in his chest that no amount of money could heal. This was the world Rosa Martinez entered on a cold Monday morning in November, carrying nothing but a worn leather purse and the quiet dignity of a woman who had survived worse things than wealthy people's indifference. She had taken the red line from Pilsen, transferring to the brown line, then walking 4 blocks through downtown Chicago's financial district to reach the gleaming tower that housed Ethan's isolation. Rosa had learned about the job opening through Maria Santos, her neighbor who cleaned offices in the Loop. The position paid $18 an hour, more than the minimum wage job she'd been working, enough to help her send money to her younger sister Sophia, who was raising 3 children alone after her husband's construction accident left him disabled and unable to work. Rosa needed this job not for luxury, but for survival, for dignity, for the simple human desire to matter in a world that had taught her that women like her were invisible. At 53, Rosa carried herself with the grace of someone who had learned that backbone was more valuable than beauty, that endurance was more powerful than appearance. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, streaked with silver threads she wore like badges of honor. Her hands told the story of her life, calluses from years of cleaning, cooking, and caring for others, fingernails kept short and clean, wedding ring finger bare since her husband Carlos had died in a factory accident 8 years ago, leaving her with a mountain of medical debt and a daughter to raise alone. Rosa's daughter, Isabella, was now 25 and working as a nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, finally independent after years of sacrifice and struggle. Rosa had worked 3 jobs to put Isabella through community college, cleaning office buildings at night, working in a school cafeteria during the day, and babysitting neighborhood children on weekends. Every dollar had been carefully budgeted, every expense weighed against the dream of giving her daughter opportunities Rosa had never had. Now, for the first time in decades, Rosa could focus on herself, not selfishly, but with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had fulfilled her deepest obligations and could finally breathe. The job at the Whitaker penthouse represented more than income. It was a chance to work in a place where attention to detail mattered, where her skills could be appreciated, where she might finally be seen as more than just another pair of hands. She had dressed carefully for her first day, a navy blue blouse ironed until it was crisp, dark slacks that had seen better years but were impeccably clean, and comfortable shoes that would carry her through long days on marble floors. Rosa understood that in houses like this, appearance mattered, but she also understood that performance mattered more. She had references from every family she had worked for in the past 15 years, letters praising her reliability, her discretion, her ability to care for homes as if they were her own. The security guard in the lobby, a tired-looking man named Frank, had checked her identification twice and made her wait while he called upstairs for confirmation. Rosa sat patiently in a leather chair that probably cost more than she earned in a month, watching well-dressed people flow in and out of elevators, each one radiating the confident energy of those who had never questioned whether they belonged in spaces like this. When the elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, Rosa stepped into a world that took her breath away. The penthouse stretched before her like a museum exhibit, all clean lines, muted colors, and carefully curated emptiness. The air smelled of expensive cleaning products and something indefinable, the scent of loneliness perhaps, or the absence of life truly being lived. Margaret met her at the door with the warmth of a winter morning. She was a woman who had clearly mastered the art of looking down on people without actually lowering her chin, her gray hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her facial features, her pale blue eyes assessing Rosa like a general examining a potentially defective weapon. "You're the new girl," Margaret said, not a question, but a statement delivered with the enthusiasm of someone discussing root canal surgery. I suppose Maria Santos told you what's expected here. Rosa nodded respectfully. Yes, ma'am. I understand Mr. Whitaker values privacy and professionalism. Mr. Whitaker values invisibility, Margaret corrected sharply. You clean what needs cleaning, you touch nothing that doesn't require touching, and you speak only when spoken to. This isn't some suburban house where you can chat with the family over coffee. This is a serious household with serious expectations. As Margaret led her through the penthouse, Rosa absorbed every detail. The living room was dominated by a massive sectional sofa that faced floor-to-ceiling windows, the leather so pristine it looked like no one had ever sat on it. Abstract paintings hung on walls painted in shades of gray and white, their meanings as mysterious as their price tags. The dining room featured a table that could seat 12, set with crystal glasses and silver serving pieces that gleamed under designer lighting fixtures. But what struck Rosa most was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a home at rest, but the heavy silence of a space where conversation had died, where laughter had been forgotten, where the only sounds were the hum of expensive appliances and the whisper of air conditioning maintaining perfect temperature control. It was the silence of wealth without joy, of success without satisfaction. Margaret's voice cut through Rosa's observations. Mr. Whitaker is in his office conducting business meetings. You are not to disturb him under any circumstances. He takes his coffee black at 8 in the morning, lunch is usually delivered from downtown restaurants, and he retires to his bedroom by 11. Your job is to maintain this household without being noticed. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, Rosa replied, though something in Margaret's tone suggested that understanding was not the same as succeeding. There was a hardness in the older woman's manner that spoke of someone guarding territory, someone who had built her position on maintaining distance between the employer and anyone who might threaten her control. Rosa was given a supply closet filled with cleaning products that cost more than she typically spent on groceries in a month, equipment that gleamed with the efficiency of commercial-grade machinery, and uniforms that were to be worn only within the penthouse and laundered daily. Everything was organized with military precision, labeled and inventoried as if the household were a corporation rather than a home. As she began her first day, moving quietly through rooms that echoed with emptiness, Rosa couldn't help but notice the photographs scattered throughout the penthouse. They were professional shots, the kind taken at expensive events or family portraits commissioned for holiday cards, but they told a story of gradual disappearance. The earlier photos showed a complete family: Ethan, a beautiful woman who must have been Catherine, and 2 young children laughing in what looked like genuine happiness. But as the photos progressed chronologically, the smiles became more forced, the body language more distant, until the final photos showed only Ethan alone at business functions, his face wearing the expression of a man going through motions without feeling. The children's bedrooms remained exactly as they had been left. Emma's room decorated in the pink and white of early adolescence, Michael's featuring sports memorabilia and video game posters that had probably been chosen years ago. Both rooms had the preserved quality of museum exhibits, spaces maintained in amber, waiting for occupants who rarely came. Margaret watched Rosa's every move during those first hours, appearing silently around corners, checking her work with the intensity of someone expecting to find fault. Rosa had worked for suspicious employers before, people whose wealth had taught them that everyone had a price, that loyalty could be bought but never trusted. She understood the game and played it with the patience of someone who had learned that proving herself required time, consistency, and the kind of quiet competence that eventually spoke louder than words. The penthouse's kitchen was where Rosa felt most at home. Though it was equipped with appliances that belonged in professional restaurants, a Sub-Zero refrigerator, a Viking range, a wine cooler that held bottles worth more than her monthly rent, it had the abandoned quality of a space designed for entertaining that never happened. The refrigerator contained expensive ingredients that had been delivered but never used, imported cheeses growing moldy in their wrapping, organic vegetables wilting in climate-controlled drawers. As Rosa organized and cleaned, she began to understand the rhythm of Ethan Whitaker's life. He emerged from his office at precise times, moving through the penthouse like a ghost haunting his own home. He was a tall man with the kind of silver hair that came from distinction rather than age, wearing tailored suits even when working from home, carrying himself with the stiff posture of someone who had forgotten how to relax. His eyes, when Rosa caught glimpses of them, held the distant focus of someone looking inward rather than outward, calculating figures and strategies rather than noticing the world around him. Their first direct interaction came on Rosa's third day, when she was dusting the living room, and Ethan emerged from his office earlier than usual, talking loudly into a wireless headset about Bitcoin fluctuations and market volatility. Rosa continued working quietly, making herself as invisible as possible, but something in her movements must have caught his attention. "Excuse me," he said, and Rosa turned, surprised by the sharp edge in his voice. "Who authorized you to touch the electronics?" Rosa looked down at the remote controls she had been carefully dusting, confused. "I was just cleaning, Mr. Whitaker. Margaret said to dust all surfaces." "Those remotes control a home automation system worth $50,000, Ethan said, his voice carrying the impatience of someone accustomed to being surrounded by incompetence. "They're programmed with specific settings that took technicians weeks to configure. One wrong button and thousands of dollars in equipment could be disrupted." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Rosa felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the familiar sting of being treated as if her touch could contaminate precious objects. She'd been cleaning homes for 30 years, had never broken anything valuable, had never violated trust, but she understood that her history meant nothing in a world where suspicion was the default setting. "I apologize, Mr. Whitaker," she said quietly, setting the remotes down as if they were made of crystal. "I'll be more careful." Ethan studied her for a moment, and Rosa saw something flicker in his eyes, not just annoyance but a deeper wariness, the look of someone who had been hurt too many times to take chances. He nodded curtly and disappeared back into his office, leaving Rosa alone with the echo of another barrier erected, another wall built between employer and employee. Margaret appeared within minutes, as if she had been listening from around the corner. "I told you to be careful," she said with the satisfaction of someone whose predictions had been proven correct. "Mr. Whitaker doesn't tolerate mistakes. The last girl lasted 2 weeks before she broke a crystal vase worth more than a car. He fired her on the spot." But Rosa had survived worse storms than the disapproval of suspicious employers. She continued her work with steady patience, learning the rhythms and rules of the penthouse, understanding that earning trust in this place would be like growing flowers in frozen ground, possible, but requiring extraordinary patience and care. As evening settled over Chicago, casting long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Rosa finished her first week in Ethan Whitaker's world. She rode the red line back to Pilsen, watching the city's lights blur past, carrying with her the weight of unspoken challenges and the quiet determination of a woman who had learned that some battles were won not through force, but through the persistent power of showing up day after day with dignity intact. The following Monday morning brought November's first snowfall to Chicago, dusting the city in white that transformed the urban landscape into something softer, more forgiving. Rosa emerged from the 18th Street station, wrapping her coat tighter against the wind that cut between buildings like a knife. The financial district looked different under snow, cleaner somehow, as if nature had decided to give the harsh edges of commerce a temporary reprieve. She arrived at the penthouse building earlier than usual, nodding to Frank, who had begun to recognize her and no longer required extensive identification checks. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor had become routine, but Rosa still felt the subtle shift in air pressure, the way the city fell away beneath her feet. Ascending into a world where problems were solved with money and isolation was mistaken for security. Margaret was waiting with what had become her standard morning briefing, a list of tasks delivered with military precision and underlying suspicion. "The cleaning service didn't properly address the guest bathroom last week," she announced without preamble. "I want you to inspect their work and correct whatever they missed. Also, Mr. Whitaker has requested that all household staff undergo background verification updates. I'll need your personal references again." Rosa nodded, understanding that the request for references was less about security and more about Margaret's need to maintain control through bureaucratic intimidation. She had worked for families before where the head of staff used paperwork as a weapon, creating obstacles designed to make employees feel temporary and replaceable. As Rosa began her work, she noticed changes in the penthouse that spoke to the approaching holiday season. Expensive catalogs lay scattered on Ethan's desk, luxury retailers advertising gift packages that cost more than most families' monthly mortgage payments. But there were no decorations, no signs of celebration, no indication that Christmas meant anything more than another business quarter ending. The guest bathroom Margaret had mentioned was immaculate, as Rosa had expected. The cleaning service employed by the building was professional and thorough, but Rosa understood that perfection was not the point. Control was. She spent an hour re-cleaning surfaces that didn't need attention, polishing fixtures that already gleamed, understanding that the task was designed to remind her of her place in the household hierarchy. It was while she was organizing cleaning supplies that Rosa first heard the shouting. Ethan's voice, raised in anger, came through the walls of his office like distant thunder. She could make out fragments of the conversation, something about dividend discrepancies, investment losses, and legal action. The words cryptocurrency fraud and missing assets carried clearly, along with language that made Rosa grateful she couldn't understand the full context. The shouting continued for nearly an hour, followed by silence that felt more ominous than the anger had been. Rosa continued working, but she found herself listening for sounds that would indicate whether Ethan was all right, whether whatever crisis had erupted was manageable or catastrophic. When Ethan finally emerged from his office, Rosa was surprised by his appearance. His usually immaculate hair was disheveled, his tie loosened, his face carrying the gray pallor of someone who had received devastating news. He moved through the living room like a man walking underwater, his usual purposeful stride replaced by the uncertain steps of someone whose world had shifted beneath his feet. Rosa was dusting a bookshelf near the windows when Ethan collapsed onto the sectional sofa, the first time she had seen him actually sit in his own living room. He stared out at the city below, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white, his breathing shallow and rapid. Without thinking, Rosa moved toward the kitchen and began preparing something she had learned long ago could provide comfort when words failed. Coffee, but not the expensive single-origin beans Ethan usually preferred. Instead, she used the simple Colombian blend she had brought from home, brewing it slowly, adding a touch of cinnamon and a hint of brown sugar, creating something that smelled like warmth and care rather than caffeine and efficiency. She approached Ethan carefully, the way one might approach a wounded animal, setting the mug on the coffee table within his reach, but not forcing his attention. "I thought you might like something warm," she said quietly. Ethan looked up, and for the first time since Rosa had begun working for him, she saw his eyes clearly. They held the bewildered pain of someone whose carefully constructed defenses had been breached, whose faith in his ability to control outcomes through wealth and caution had been shattered once again. "They got me again," he said, speaking to no one in particular. "David Chen, my former business partner. Even after all the security measures, all the background checks, all the precautions, he found another way. Cryptocurrency investments we made jointly 5 years ago, money I thought was secure. Turns out he's been using backdated transactions and shell companies to claim ownership of assets that were legally mine." Rosa didn't respond immediately, understanding that sometimes people needed to speak their pain aloud before they could begin processing it. She had learned this during the months after Carlos died, when talking to neighbors and friends helped her make sense of a loss that felt incomprehensible. Ethan lifted the coffee mug, and Rosa watched as his expression changed slightly. The smell, the warmth, The simple human gesture of care seemed to register in some part of his brain that had been dormant. "This isn't my usual coffee," he said, not accusingly, but with curiosity. "It's what my grandmother used to make," Rosa replied. "She said expensive things could feed the body, but simple things made with care could feed the soul." They sat in silence while snow continued to fall outside the windows, transforming Chicago into something gentler than its usual harsh edges. Rosa continued dusting, moving quietly around the living room, while Ethan drank the coffee and stared at the city below. "How do you trust anyone again?" he asked suddenly, the question directed more to the universe than to Rosa specifically. "How do you open your life to people when experience teaches you that everyone has a price, everyone has an agenda, everyone eventually reveals their true purpose?" Rosa paused in her cleaning, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. She had been betrayed too, by Carlos's family, who had blamed her for his death and tried to claim his small life insurance policy, by employers who had promised raises that never materialized, by friends who had asked for loans they never intended to repay. "I think maybe trust isn't something you give all at once," she said carefully. "Maybe it's something you build slowly, like planting seeds and waiting to see what grows. Some people earn a little trust, some people earn more, and some people—" She paused, thinking about Carlos, about Isabella, about the neighbors who had helped her through impossible times. "Some people earn everything." Ethan turned to look at her, and Rosa saw that he was actually listening, not just waiting for her to finish speaking so he could return to his thoughts. "But how do you tell the difference?" he asked. "How do you know who deserves trust and who's just better at hiding their intentions?" Rosa smiled, the expression transforming her face from professional politeness to genuine warmth. "You watch how they treat people who can't do anything for them," she said. "You watch how they behave when they think no one is paying attention, and you trust your instincts, even when your hurt tries to convince you that everyone is dangerous." Margaret's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. "Rosa, Mr. Whitaker doesn't pay you for personal conversations," she said, appearing in the living room with the silent efficiency of someone who had been eavesdropping. "He has business calls to make, and you have work to complete." Rosa felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from the sharp reminder of her place in the household hierarchy. Ethan, however, surprised her by responding before she could apologize. "Actually, Margaret, I initiated the conversation," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions. "Rosa was being helpful during a difficult morning. I don't need you to monitor my interactions with the staff." Margaret's expression tightened, and Rosa recognized the look, the pinched features of someone whose control had been questioned, whose authority had been undermined in front of a subordinate. It was a look that promised future complications, future tests, future opportunities for revenge disguised as household management. "Of course, Mr. Whitaker," Margaret replied with icy professionalism. "I was simply ensuring that your privacy and productivity were protected." As Margaret withdrew, Rosa returned to her cleaning with renewed focus, understanding that her brief moment of human connection with Ethan had been noted, cataloged, and filed away as evidence of overstepping boundaries. She had worked in enough wealthy households to recognize the dynamics, head staff members who built their positions on maintaining distance between employers and other employees, who viewed any unauthorized intimacy as a threat to their carefully constructed power structures. The rest of the day passed without incident, but Rosa sensed a shift in the penthouse atmosphere. Ethan remained in his office, but the quality of his isolation felt different, less like self-imposed exile and more like someone processing difficult emotions. Margaret moved through the household with increased vigilance, checking Rosa's work more frequently, asking pointed questions about her activities and observations. That evening, as Rosa prepared to leave, she found a note on the kitchen counter written in Ethan's careful handwriting. "Thank you for the coffee and the conversation. Both were exactly what I needed." It wasn't signed, but Rosa recognized the precise penmanship from documents she had seen on his desk. The note represented something dangerous in Margaret's world: direct communication between employer and employee, circumventing the established chain of command. Rosa folded it carefully and placed it in her purse, understanding that it was both a gift and a potential weapon that could be used against her. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Rosa reflected on the morning's events. She had seen something in Ethan's eyes that went beyond suspicion and control: a genuine curiosity about human connection, a hunger for authentic interaction that had been starved by years of betrayal and isolation. It was the look of someone who wanted to trust again, but had forgotten how. The Red Line train carried Rosa back toward Pilsen through a city transformed by snow. Chicago's harsh edges looked softer under the white covering, and Rosa found herself thinking about seeds planted in frozen ground, about the patience required to wait for spring, about the quiet courage needed to keep believing that growth was possible, even when evidence suggested otherwise. In her small apartment, surrounded by the warm chaos of a life fully lived, Isabella's nursing textbook still scattered on the kitchen table, photographs covering every surface, the lingering scent of yesterday's dinner, Rosa understood more clearly the emptiness that wealth without love could create. Ethan's penthouse was beautiful, but it was also tomb-like in its perfection, a place where objects were more valuable than memories, where security took precedence over connection. She made herself dinner, simple rice and beans with vegetables from the corner market, and thought about Ethan's question regarding trust. The truth was more complex than her answer had suggested. Trust wasn't just about watching how people behaved. It was about accepting vulnerability, about choosing hope over fear, even when fear had been proven right before. It was about believing that not everyone who entered your life came to take something away. As snow continued to fall outside her window, covering Chicago in white silence, Rosa said a prayer for the wounded millionaire who lived 42 floors above the city, surrounded by everything money could buy, but lacking the simple human warmth that made life worth living. She prayed that his heart would find healing, that his trust would grow slowly but surely, and that he would learn the difference between being alone and being lonely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of patience and dignity. Margaret would continue her campaign of suspicion and control. Ethan would struggle with the conflicting desires for connection and protection. But Rosa had learned long ago that some battles were won not through dramatic gestures, but through the accumulation of small kindnesses, consistent presence, and the patient faith that human hearts, no matter how wounded, retained the capacity for healing. The weekend passed quietly for Rosa, filled with the ordinary activities that made her feel grounded: grocery shopping at the Pilsen market, attending Saturday evening mass at St. Adalbert, and Sunday dinner with Isabella, who had finally managed a day off from her demanding schedule at Northwestern Memorial. They sat in Rosa's small kitchen, sharing stories and laughter over homemade pozole, the conversation flowing between English and Spanish with the comfortable ease of family. Isabella had inherited her mother's strength but expressed it differently, through medical expertise rather than domestic care, through professional achievement rather than quiet service. At 25, she moved through the world with confidence Rosa had never possessed at that age, and watching her daughter thrive filled Rosa with the deep satisfaction of sacrifices that had proven worthwhile. "How's the new job, Mommy?" Isabella asked, ladling another portion of pozole into Rosa's bowl. "You said it was different from the other families." Rosa considered how to explain the complexities of the Whitaker household. "It's a sad house," she said finally. "Beautiful, but sad. The man who owns it has so much money he could buy anything, but he's forgotten how to be happy." Isabella, whose nursing experience had taught her to read between lines, nodded with understanding. "Rich people get sick too," she said. "Sometimes sicker than poor people, because money can't fix everything. What's wrong with him?" "His wife left him, his business partner stole from him, his children barely visit," Rosa replied. "He's built walls so high he can't see over them anymore." "And you think you can help?" Isabella's question carried both concern and admiration. She had watched her mother's gift for healing wounded families, her ability to bring warmth to cold houses, but she also understood the emotional cost of caring for people who might never acknowledge or appreciate that care. "I don't know if I can help," Rosa answered honestly, "but I know I have to try. There's something in his eyes. Misha. Like he wants to trust again, but doesn't remember how." Monday morning brought December's arrival to Chicago, with temperatures that made November's snow feel tropical by comparison. Rosa bundled herself in layers, knowing that the walk from the train station to Ethan's building would test even her experienced tolerance for Chicago winters. The city looked clean and sharp under the bright blue sky, every surface crystallized by cold that turned breath into clouds and made footsteps ring like gunshots on frozen pavement. Margaret greeted Rosa with news that felt like a test disguised as information. "Mr. Whitaker's children will be visiting this weekend," she announced. "Emma and Michael, his teenagers. They haven't been here in over a month, and their last visit was—" She paused, allowing disapproval to fill the silence. "Difficult. Mr. Whitaker wants the penthouse to be perfect. I trust you understand what perfect means in this context." Rosa nodded, understanding that preparation for the children's visit would involve standards even higher than the penthouse's usual immaculate maintenance. But she also heard something else in Margaret's tone. Anticipation, as if the head housekeeper was looking forward to the chaos that might result from family interaction, the potential for mistakes that could be blamed on Rosa's inexperience. The week passed with intense preparation. Rosa cleaned rooms that were already spotless, polished surfaces that gleamed, and organized spaces that showed no evidence of disarray. But as she worked, she began to notice details that revealed more about the approaching visit than Margaret's warnings had conveyed. Ethan emerged from his office more frequently, walking through the penthouse with the nervous energy of someone preparing for an important business meeting rather than a family reunion. He checked and rechecked details, the temperature settings, the stocking of the children's favorite foods, the arrangement of fresh flowers in rooms that usually remained undecorated. His behavior suggested not excitement, but anxiety, the demeanor of someone hoping to avoid disappointment by controlling every variable possible. The children's bedrooms received special attention. Rosa spent hours ensuring that Emma's room was dusted and refreshed, that Michael's space showed no signs of neglect. But as she worked, she noticed that both rooms felt like museum exhibits, preserved exactly as they had been left months ago, unchanged by growth or new interests or the natural evolution of teenage lives. They were shrines to children who no longer existed, maintained by a father who seemed afraid that updating the rooms might acknowledge how much distance had grown between them. On Thursday afternoon, Rosa was organizing the kitchen when she overheard a phone conversation that provided context for Ethan's anxiety. He was speaking to someone, perhaps his lawyer or a family counselor, about the upcoming visit, and his voice carried the strain of someone trying to solve an emotional problem through logistical planning. "I've arranged for tickets to that new musical Emma mentioned months ago," he said, pacing near the windows that overlooked the river. "And Michael's interested in that virtual reality arcade downtown. I thought we could have dinner at that steakhouse they used to enjoy, the one with the piano player." There was a pause while the other person responded, and Rosa could hear the tension in Ethan's silence. "No, I haven't asked them directly what they want to do," he continued. "I thought surprising them would be better than giving them opportunities to decline." Another pause. "Yes, I understand that might backfire. But what's the alternative? Calling Catherine to ask what they're interested in now? Having to admit that I don't really know my own children anymore?" Rosa felt her heart tighten with recognition. She had seen this before. Divorced parents trying to compress months of missed connection into weekend visits, believing that expensive activities could substitute for daily presence, that carefully planned entertainment could replace the comfortable routine of shared life. Ethan was trying to buy back his children's affection with experiences rather than earning it through patient rebuilding of trust and communication. Friday afternoon brought a flurry of last-minute preparations. Fresh flowers were delivered and arranged throughout the penthouse. The refrigerator was stocked with organic foods and premium brands, and the entertainment system was updated with the latest movies and shows. Margaret supervised these activities with military efficiency, but Rosa noticed her increasing scrutiny of every detail, as if she were preparing for battle rather than a family visit. "The children will arrive tomorrow at noon," Margaret informed Rosa as they completed the final preparations. "Mr. Whitaker has planned activities for the entire weekend, so they'll be out of the penthouse most of the time. However, when they are here, I expect absolute professionalism. No unnecessary conversation, no attempts to engage them in personal discussions, no interference with family dynamics you couldn't possibly understand." Rosa nodded, but something in Margaret's tone suggested deeper concerns. The head housekeeper seemed almost eager for Rosa to make mistakes, as if the children's visit provided opportunities for demonstrating Rosa's inadequacy or inappropriate behavior. Saturday morning arrived with temperatures so cold that even Chicago natives complained. Rosa dressed warmly, knowing that she would spend the day ensuring that the penthouse remained perfect, while Ethan attempted to reconnect with children who might prefer to be anywhere else. She arrived early, before the children were scheduled to appear, and found Ethan already awake and dressed, standing at the living room windows with coffee he wasn't drinking. He wore casual clothes, expensively casual, the kind of jeans and sweater that cost more than Rosa's monthly rent, but his posture betrayed the formality of someone who hadn't learned how to relax even in his own home. "They'll be here soon," he said without turning around, as if speaking to the city below rather than to Rosa. "I haven't seen them since October. Emma's probably grown another inch, and Michael's voice has been changing. I feel like I'm meeting strangers who happen to share my DNA." Rosa continued her work quietly, but she found herself listening for the elevator that would bring Ethan's children into this carefully prepared but emotionally sterile environment. She wondered what they would think of the penthouse's perfection, whether they would appreciate the expensive preparations or feel intimidated by the pressure to live up to their father's anxious expectations. The elevator doors opened at exactly noon, and Rosa heard voices in the hallway, a teenage girl speaking rapidly about something, a younger male voice responding with the typical monosyllables of adolescent communication, and beneath both, the sound of wheels rolling across marble floors as luggage was transported from elevator to penthouse. Emma entered first, and Rosa was struck by how much the girl resembled her father. The same sharp intelligence in her eyes, the same careful posture, but translated through 17 years of life that had taught her to be guarded rather than generous. She was taller than Rosa had expected, moving with the self-conscious grace of someone still adjusting to recently acquired height, her dark hair falling in waves that suggested professional styling. Her clothes carried designer labels but were worn with the casual indifference of someone who had never questioned whether she deserved expensive things. Michael followed, 15 years old, and carrying himself with the awkward defensiveness typical of teenage boys who felt uncomfortable in formal settings. He was shorter than his sister, but showed signs of the growth spurt that would eventually give him his father's height, his features still caught between childhood and adulthood. Unlike Emma's designer casualness, Michael's clothes seemed chosen primarily for comfort. A basketball team hoodie, jeans that were slightly too long, and sneakers that had seen serious use. "Hey, Dad," Emma said, offering Ethan a brief hug that carried obligation rather than enthusiasm. Michael managed a handshake that looked more like a business transaction than family affection. Rosa watched this reunion while continuing her work in the kitchen, noting the careful distance each family member maintained, the way conversation felt scripted rather than spontaneous. These were people who shared history but had lost the rhythm of comfortable interaction, who remembered loving each other but had forgotten how to express it naturally. "I thought we'd start with brunch at that place overlooking the lake," Ethan said with the enthusiasm of someone following a carefully prepared agenda. "Then the matinee show, dinner downtown, maybe some shopping if you're interested." Emma and Michael exchanged glances that Rosa recognized, the look of children who had learned to accept their parents' plans without enthusiasm, who understood that resistance would create conflict they preferred to avoid. Sounds good, Emma replied with politeness that felt more diplomatic than genuine. Whatever, Michael added, the single word carrying the weight of adolescent acceptance of situations beyond his control. Rosa continued working as the family prepared for their day out, but she couldn't help noticing the details that revealed deeper truths. Emma moved through the penthouse like a visitor, touching nothing casually, treating the space with the formal respect reserved for other people's homes. Michael seemed overwhelmed by the apartment's size and luxury, his eyes moving constantly as if trying to process how different this world was from wherever he lived with his mother. Most telling was Ethan's behavior, the way he hovered around his children like a nervous host, offering drinks and snacks they didn't want, pointing out features of the penthouse they had seen before, filling every moment of silence with planned activities and scheduled entertainment. He was trying so hard to be a perfect father that he had forgotten how to be a real person. As they prepared to leave for brunch, Rosa overheard Emma whisper to Michael, "Just get through the weekend, okay? We'll be home Sunday night." The words hit Rosa like a physical blow. Home wasn't here, in this penthouse that Ethan had prepared so carefully. Home was wherever their mother lived, wherever they felt like themselves, rather than visitors in their father's carefully controlled world. After they left, Rosa continued working in penthouse silence that felt heavier than usual. Margaret moved through the apartment with satisfied efficiency, checking Rosa's work and making subtle observations about appropriate boundaries and professional distance. But Rosa found herself thinking about the family that had just departed, 3 people who loved each other but had lost the language of natural affection, who were spending the weekend trying to rebuild connection through expensive activities rather than simple presence. The afternoon passed slowly. Rosa organized closets that didn't need organization, polished appliances that were already spotless, and tried not to think about how the family's day was progressing. Were Emma and Michael enjoying the planned activities, or were they counting hours until they could return to wherever they felt genuinely comfortable? Was Ethan able to relax and connect with his children, or was he monitoring their reactions like a business presentation he needed to perfect? When they returned in the early evening, Rosa could read the day's outcome in their body language before they spoke. Emma looked tired in the way that comes from performing enthusiasm. Michael seemed relieved to be back in a space where conversation wasn't required, and Ethan carried himself with the deflated posture of someone whose carefully planned efforts had fallen short of hoped-for results. "How was the show?" Margaret asked with professional interest. "It was fine," Emma replied with the same diplomacy she had shown that morning. "The food was good," Ethan added, trying to salvage positive elements from what had clearly been a difficult day. "And the restaurant had that view you both used to enjoy." Rosa noticed the phrase, "used to enjoy," past tense, acknowledging that current preferences might be different from remembered ones, that the children who had once loved specific things might have grown into different people with new interests. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, at the table that seated 12 but held only 3. Rosa helped Margaret present the meal, expensive takeout from a downtown restaurant, served on china that cost more than most families' monthly grocery budgets. She moved quietly around the table, refilling water glasses and replacing serving pieces, trying to remain invisible while being acutely aware of the conversation happening around her. "So how's school?" Ethan asked, the question carrying the weight of someone trying to bridge months of missed communication with a single inquiry. "It's fine," Emma replied, the response revealing nothing while technically answering the question. "And basketball?" Ethan turned to Michael, who shrugged non-committally. "We lost our last 3 games," Michael said. "Coach says we're rebuilding." "Maybe I could come to a game sometime," Ethan suggested, the offer carrying hope wrapped in uncertainty. Emma and Michael exchanged another glance, and Rosa recognized the look that passed between them. Siblings communicating without words, sharing an understanding their father couldn't access. "They're usually on weeknights," Emma said carefully, "and most of them are away games this season." The conversation continued in similar patterns throughout the meal, Ethan asking questions designed to demonstrate interest, his children providing answers that revealed minimal information, everyone working to maintain politeness while avoiding genuine connection. They were like actors reading from a script none of them had written, performing family relationship rather than actually having one. After dinner, Emma retreated to her room with homework she claimed needed attention, and Michael settled in the living room with his phone, absorbed in games or social media that excluded the adults. Ethan wandered through the penthouse with the aimless energy of someone whose carefully planned evening had dissolved into the ordinary loneliness he had hoped to escape. Rosa was cleaning the kitchen when Ethan appeared, moving with the distracted pace of someone trying to process disappointment without admitting defeat. "They seem older," he said, not really speaking to Rosa but needing to voice his observation aloud. "More mature, but also more distant. I keep trying to connect with them, but it feels like I'm speaking a language they don't understand anymore." Rosa continued washing dishes while considering her response. She had watched the dinner conversation, had seen the careful distance the children maintained, had recognized the pattern of family members who had learned to coexist without truly connecting. "Maybe they don't need you to entertain them," she said quietly. "Maybe they just need you to be present with them." Ethan turned to look at her, and Rosa saw the confusion in his eyes, the look of someone who had confused being a provider with being a parent, who had tried to substitute experiences for presence. "But they seemed bored by everything we did today," he said. "The show, the restaurant, even shopping. I spent more money than most people earn in a month, and they acted like they were doing me a favor by participating." Rosa dried her hands carefully before responding, choosing her words with the care of someone who understood how much pain lived behind Ethan's question. "When Isabella was 15, she said, I thought I had to prove I was a good mother by giving her things I couldn't afford, experiences that would show her how much she mattered to me. I worked extra shifts to buy her expensive birthday presents, saved money for months to take her to fancy restaurants. But you know what she remembers most from that time? Saturday mornings when we had nothing planned, when we sat in the kitchen making breakfast together and talking about everything and nothing." She paused, seeing that Ethan was listening with the intensity of someone desperate for understanding. "Your children don't need you to prove your love with activities and expenses," Rosa continued. "They need you to show them who you are when you're not trying to impress them. They need to see the person behind the father, the man behind the money." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, processing this perspective that challenged everything he had believed about reconnecting with his children. But what if they discover that the person behind all of this isn't someone they particularly like? He asked, the question revealing deeper fears than Rosa had expected. "What if I take away the entertainment and the expensive activities, and what's left isn't enough to hold their interest?" Rosa recognized the fear in his voice, the terror of being known and found wanting, the possibility that authenticity might lead to rejection rather than connection. It was the same fear that had kept him isolated in his penthouse, surrounded by security measures and emotional barriers that protected him from vulnerability. "That's the risk you have to take if you want real love instead of purchased affection," she said gently. "Children can tell the difference between someone trying to buy their time and someone genuinely wanting to know them. Your children are smart. They see through the planned activities and expensive presents. What they're waiting for is proof that you care more about them than about their opinion of you." Margaret's appearance in the kitchen doorway ended the conversation abruptly, her expression carrying the disapproval Rosa had come to expect whenever she engaged in anything beyond strictly professional interaction with Ethan. "Mr. Whitaker, I believe Emma was asking for you in the living room," Margaret said, though Rosa had heard no such request. Ethan left immediately, but not before giving Rosa a look that suggested their conversation had provided something he needed. Not answers, perhaps, but different questions to consider. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Rosa finished her work while the family members occupied different areas of the penthouse, each retreating to separate spaces rather than sharing communal time. By 9 o'clock, Emma and Michael had gone to bed, claiming exhaustion from their full day of activities. Ethan remained in his office long into the night, the glow from his computer screen suggesting work that might have been real or might have been an excuse to avoid the silence of failed family connection. As Rosa prepared to leave, she found a note on the kitchen counter, written in Emma's careful handwriting. "Thank you for dinner. The food was really good." It was a small gesture, but it suggested that the teenage girl had noticed Rosa's role in the evening's arrangements, had taken time to acknowledge services that usually remained invisible. Sunday brought the family's final day together, and Rosa could sense the relief that permeated the penthouse as everyone anticipated the approaching end of the visit. Ethan had planned another full day of activities, but the energy felt different, more resigned than optimistic, more dutiful than enthusiastic. They left after breakfast for what Ethan described as a surprise outing, and Rosa spent the morning preparing for the children's departure, ensuring that their rooms would be ready for their next visit, while wondering how long it might be before that occurred. When they returned in the late afternoon, the goodbye scene played out with the awkward formality that had characterized the entire visit. Emma hugged her father with genuine affection, but also evident relief that the performance was ending. Michael shook hands again, the gesture carrying slightly more warmth than it had on Friday, but still feeling more appropriate for business acquaintances than family members. "We'll see you soon," Ethan said, as if regularity could be willed into existence through repetition of the phrase. "Yeah, definitely," Emma replied with politeness that committed to nothing specific. After they left, Ethan stood at the living room windows watching the street below, though Rosa doubted he could see his children from that height. His posture carried the defeated quality of someone whose best efforts had fallen short of their intended mark, whose investment of time, money, and emotional energy had failed to produce the return he had hoped for. "Another successful weekend," Margaret commented with satisfaction that seemed directed more at Rosa than at Ethan, as if the family's disconnection validated her warnings about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. But Rosa had watched the weekend with different eyes, had recognized patterns that might be changed with patience and different approaches. Emma and Michael weren't hostile toward their father. They were cautious, protecting themselves from disappointment by limiting their expectations. Ethan wasn't failing as a father because he lacked love for his children. He was failing because he had forgotten that love required vulnerability, that connection couldn't be purchased or planned into existence. As Rosa finished her work and prepared for another week in the penthouse, she carried with her the image of three people who desperately wanted to love each other, but had lost the courage to risk authentic connection. They were like survivors of an emotional disaster, each waiting for someone else to make the first move toward rebuilding trust that had been shattered by divorce, betrayal, and the gradual accumulation of missed opportunities for genuine communication. The coming weeks would test whether any of them possessed the patience and courage required to begin again, to risk disappointment in pursuit of something deeper than the careful politeness that passed for family relationship. Rosa had planted seeds during her brief conversations with Ethan, suggestions about authenticity over entertainment, presence over presence. Whether those seeds would take root in the frozen ground of his wounded heart remained to be seen. December settled over Chicago like a heavy blanket, bringing the kind of cold that made the city feel simultaneously vibrant and brutal. The downtown financial district sparkled with holiday decorations that transformed glass towers into monuments to seasonal commerce, while the wind off Lake Michigan reminded everyone that beauty came with a price in this part of the world. Rosa had been working in the Whitaker penthouse for 6 weeks, long enough to understand the rhythms and rules that governed the household, long enough to recognize the loneliness that money couldn't cure. The children's visit had revealed depths of family dysfunction that expensive therapy sessions hadn't been able to address, and Rosa found herself thinking frequently about the careful distance Emma and Michael maintained from their father, a protective strategy that kept them safe but also kept them isolated. Margaret's suspicion of Rosa had evolved into something more systematic and dangerous. The head housekeeper had begun conducting what she called security assessments of Rosa's work, checking behind her cleaning, examining personal belongings left in the staff area, and asking pointed questions about Rosa's observations and conversations within the household. It felt less like quality control and more like surveillance designed to catch Rosa in some violation that would justify her dismissal. "I've been reviewing your references," Margaret announced on a Monday morning in mid-December, her tone carrying the satisfied authority of someone who had discovered incriminating evidence. "There are some inconsistencies I need to address with Mr. Whitaker." Rosa felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. She had been through this before. Head staff members who used bureaucratic intimidation to maintain control, who invented problems where none existed to justify their own positions. Her references were impeccable, built over 30 years of reliable service, but she understood that facts were less important than power dynamics in situations like this. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Rosa asked, though she suspected the question was rhetorical. Margaret would reveal whatever she chose to reveal, manufacturing concerns that couldn't be easily disproven. "Timeline discrepancies," Margaret replied vaguely. "Gaps in employment that aren't fully explained. Recommendations that seem overly enthusiastic for someone in your position." Rosa recognized the strategy. Accusations vague enough to create doubt, but specific enough to seem credible. Her timeline discrepancies were probably the months she had spent caring for her dying mother, unpaid time that left gaps in formal employment records. Her overly enthusiastic recommendations came from families who had genuinely appreciated her work, but in Margaret's interpretation, authentic gratitude became suspicious praise. The conversation was interrupted by Ethan's emergence from his office, looking more disheveled than usual. The business crisis that had begun weeks earlier seemed to be escalating, and Rosa could see the stress accumulating in his posture, his sleep-deprived eyes, his increasingly irregular eating habits. "Margaret, I need you to handle something," he said without acknowledging Rosa's presence. "I'm meeting with lawyers downtown this afternoon, and I may not be back until late evening. Make sure no one has access to my office while I'm gone." "Of course, Mr. Whitaker," Margaret replied with the efficiency she reserved for crisis management. "Will you need dinner prepared, or should I assume you'll be eating downtown?" "I don't know," Ethan said, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that had become increasingly common. "I don't know anything anymore. Every time I think I understand what's happening with the David Chen situation, new complications surface. My lawyers tell me one thing, my accountants tell me another, and my financial advisors seem to be updating their recommendations daily." Rosa continued her work quietly, but she couldn't help noticing the conversation's subtext. Ethan's business crisis was more serious than she had realized, involving not just the cryptocurrency investments he had mentioned weeks earlier, but broader questions about asset management and legal liability. The stress was taking a visible toll. Weight loss, irregular sleep patterns, and the kind of distracted anxiety that suggested someone constantly calculating disaster scenarios. After Ethan left for his meeting, Margaret's attention returned to Rosa with renewed focus. "I've scheduled a conference call with Mr. Whitaker's security consultant for later this week," she announced. "We'll be reviewing all household staff clearances and updating background verification protocols. I trust you have no objection to additional scrutiny." The threat was clear. Submit to increased surveillance or face termination for non-compliance. Rosa nodded with the resignation of someone who had learned that fighting such battles often cost more energy than the victories were worth. But she also began mentally preparing for the possibility that her time in the Whitaker household might be limited. Wednesday brought Chicago's first significant snowstorm of the season, transforming the city into a winter wonderland that looked beautiful from penthouse windows, but created transportation nightmares for working people who depended on public transit. Rosa's commute took nearly twice as long as usual, the Red Line experiencing delays that tested even Chicago residents' legendary patience with weather-related inconvenience. She arrived at the penthouse later than usual, expecting Margaret's disapproval, but finding instead a household in crisis. Ethan's security system was blinking emergency codes, phones were ringing continuously, and the unmistakable sound of raised voices came from behind his office door. Margaret appeared more flustered than Rosa had ever seen her, moving through the penthouse with the barely controlled panic of someone whose carefully maintained order had been disrupted by circumstances beyond her control. "Mr. Whitaker has been on conference call since 5 this morning," Margaret explained without her usual hostility toward Rosa. "There's been some kind of development with the legal situation. Lawyers, accountants, federal investigators, people have been calling continuously." Rosa began her work but found it difficult to concentrate with the ongoing crisis atmosphere. Phone calls continued throughout the morning, each one seeming to bring news that made the situation more complicated rather than clearer. She caught fragments of conversation that suggested Ethan's problems extended beyond business partnership disputes into areas that might involve criminal investigation and federal oversight. Around noon, silence finally fell over the penthouse. The phone calls stopped, the voices behind the office door quieted, and the emergency lights on the security system returned to their normal configuration. Rosa was organizing the kitchen when Ethan emerged, looking like someone who had aged years in a single morning. His usually immaculate appearance was completely disheveled, shirt wrinkled, tie loosened, hair pointing in directions that suggested frequent anxious contact with his hands. Most telling were his eyes, which carried the stunned expression of someone whose world had shifted fundamentally beneath his feet. "They froze my assets," he said to no one in particular, speaking the words as if hearing them aloud might make them more comprehensible. "Federal investigation into David Chen's business practices apparently extends to anyone who had financial dealings with him. Until they sort out which investments were legitimate and which were part of his criminal enterprise, everything is locked down." Rosa had never seen Ethan in a state of genuine vulnerability. Throughout their interactions, he had maintained the controlled demeanor of someone accustomed to managing complex problems through careful analysis and strategic planning. But the man standing in the kitchen looked fundamentally lost, as if the tools he had relied on for decades had suddenly proved inadequate for the challenges he faced. "How long?" Rosa asked quietly, the question emerging before she could consider whether it was appropriate for her to engage with his crisis. Ethan looked at her as if surprised to find another person in the room. "They don't know," he replied. "Could be weeks, could be months. Depends on the scope of the investigation, the complexity of the financial instruments involved, the cooperation of various parties. Meanwhile, I'm supposed to continue living and paying expenses and maintaining this household as if nothing has changed." The irony was stark. A multimillionaire temporarily without access to his millions, wealthy on paper, but potentially cash poor in practical terms. Rosa recognized the position from her own experience with Carlos's medical bills, when insurance complications had left them theoretically covered, but practically bankrupt while bureaucracies sorted out payment responsibilities. Margaret appeared in the kitchen with the timing of someone who had been monitoring the conversation. "Mr. Whitaker, perhaps this would be a good time to review household expenses and make necessary adjustments," she suggested, with the kind of practical coldness that Rosa had come to expect from her. "Yes," Ethan replied, though his tone suggested someone agreeing to suggestions without fully processing their implications. "Yes, we should probably adjust things." Rosa understood what adjustments meant in wealthy households experiencing financial uncertainty: staff reductions, service cuts, and the elimination of expenses that had previously seemed essential. She began mentally preparing for unemployment, calculating how long her savings might last while she searched for another position. That afternoon, while Ethan remained closeted with lawyers and accountants conducting crisis management via conference call, Rosa overheard Margaret making phone calls that confirmed her suspicions. Service contracts were being canceled, delivery schedules reduced, and temporary staff adjustments discussed with the kind of bureaucratic language designed to obscure human impact. Margaret's conversation with the building's concierge service was particularly revealing. "Mr. Whitaker is implementing cost-saving measures during a temporary business situation. We'll be reducing housekeeping staff to essential personnel only. The newer employee can be terminated immediately, Her position was always intended to be temporary. Rosa felt the familiar punch of being discussed as if she were equipment rather than a person, but she also recognized opportunity in the crisis. Wealthy families undergoing financial stress often needed more help rather than less, though they might need different kinds of assistance than they had previously required. Someone who could provide practical support during a crisis might prove more valuable than someone who simply maintained appearances during prosperous times. When Ethan emerged from his office that evening, Rosa was preparing a simple dinner with ingredients already available in the penthouse, nothing elaborate or expensive, but something warm and nourishing for someone who had forgotten to eat during a day of crisis management. "You don't need to cook," Ethan said, but without his usual authority. "I'm not sure I can afford. That is, I should probably be more careful about—" "It's just rice and beans with vegetables," Rosa interrupted gently. "Food that was already here, nothing new purchased. Someone who's had the kind of day you've had needs to eat something real." Ethan sat at the kitchen island, the first time Rosa had seen him use the casual seating rather than the formal dining room, and watched as she prepared the meal with efficient grace. The rice was perfectly cooked, the beans seasoned with cumin and garlic, the vegetables bright with color and flavor. It was simple food, but prepared with the kind of care that transformed basic ingredients into comfort. "I haven't eaten rice and beans since college," Ethan said as Rosa placed the plate before him. "Forgot how good simple food could taste when you're actually hungry." They ate together in the kitchen, an informality that would have horrified Margaret but felt natural given the circumstances. Rosa recognized that crisis had temporarily dissolved some of the barriers that normally separated employer from employee, creating space for more genuine interaction. "How do you do it?" Ethan asked between bites. "How do you go from having money to not having money without losing your mind?" Rosa smiled at the question's directness. "You learn the difference between what you need and what you want," she said. "You discover that most of what you thought was essential was actually just comfortable, and you remember that people survived long before they had money. They can survive without it too. But this penthouse, the lifestyle, the expectations—" Ethan gestured toward the expensive surroundings that suddenly seemed more like burdens than assets. "Things don't make you who you are," Rosa replied. "They're just things. You can live without them, and if you can't, then maybe you need to ask why they became more important than the person living among them." Ethan was quiet for a long time, processing this perspective that challenged fundamental assumptions about success and security. "My children are going to find out about this," he said eventually. "The asset freeze, the investigation, all of it. They're going to see their father as someone who got involved with criminals, who couldn't protect his own family's financial security." Rosa heard the deeper fear beneath his words, not just loss of money, but loss of respect, loss of the identity he had built around being a successful provider and protector. "Maybe they'll see you as someone who's human," she suggested, "someone who makes mistakes but handles them with dignity, someone who faces problems instead of running from them." "Or maybe they'll see me as a failure," Ethan replied, voicing the fear that had been consuming him. Rosa looked at this wounded man sitting in his expensive kitchen, eating simple food and confronting the possibility that his carefully constructed world might collapse, and she saw something he couldn't see himself: courage in the face of uncertainty, integrity in refusing to blame others for his situation, and a capacity for growth that might emerge from crisis. "Your children don't need you to be perfect," she said. "They need you to be real. Maybe this situation, as difficult as it is, could be the beginning of something better between you and them." Margaret's appearance in the kitchen interrupted the conversation, her expression registering disapproval at the informal dinner arrangement and the obvious intimacy of the discussion she had witnessed. "Mr. Whitaker, your attorney called," she announced with professional coolness. "He needs to speak with you immediately about tomorrow's proceedings." Ethan stood to take the call, but before leaving the kitchen, he turned back to Rosa. "Thank you," he said simply. "For the food, for listening, for—" He paused. searching for words to describe something he couldn't quite name, for treating me like a person instead of a situation to be managed. After he left, Margaret fixed Rosa with a stare that carried both triumph and warning. "I hope you understand that tomorrow will likely be your last day here," she said with satisfaction that barely concealed itself as professional regret. "Mr. Whitaker can no longer afford unnecessary staff, and your position was always considered supplementary to essential household functions." Rosa nodded with the dignity of someone who had faced termination before and survived it. "I understand," she replied simply. But as she finished cleaning the kitchen and prepared to leave the penthouse, Rosa found herself thinking about Ethan's question: how do you go from having money to not having money without losing your mind? The answer, she knew from personal experience, was that you discovered resources within yourself that money couldn't buy, relationships that mattered more than assets, and strength that came from character rather than bank accounts. Tomorrow would bring unemployment and uncertainty, but it would also bring opportunity to discover whether the seeds of authentic connection planted during weeks of patient service had taken root deeply enough to survive the winter of crisis that had descended upon the Whitaker household. The next morning arrived gray and bitter, with the kind of December cold that makes Chicago feel like the edge of the habitable world. Rosa dressed carefully for what Margaret had indicated would be her final day at the Whitaker penthouse, choosing clothes that reflected dignity despite circumstances: a navy blouse ironed until crisp, slacks that were modest but well-maintained, and the small silver earrings Isabella had given her for her birthday. She took the red line downtown through a city that looked crystalline under winter sunlight, watching familiar neighborhoods pass by while preparing mentally for another job search, another round of interviews, another process of proving her worth to people who might see her as a temporary solution to domestic problems, rather than a human being with decades of experience and quiet wisdom. Margaret was waiting with papers when Rosa arrived, termination documents prepared with the efficiency of someone who had been anticipating this moment. "Mr. Whitaker's financial situation requires immediate cost reductions," she explained with professional satisfaction. "Your services are no longer required. You'll receive payment through today, and I've prepared a standard reference letter that acknowledges your adequate performance during your brief employment here." Rosa read through the documents, noting the careful language that provided legal protection for the employer, while revealing nothing about the quality of her work or the circumstances of her dismissal. The reference letter was particularly impersonal, 3 sentences that could have described any domestic employee, containing no specific details that would distinguish Rosa from dozens of other women who cleaned wealthy homes throughout Chicago. "I understand," Rosa replied, signing the papers with the resignation of someone who had learned that fighting such battles often caused more damage than acceptance. "I'll collect my things and finish whatever work needs to be completed today." But as Rosa began gathering her personal belongings from the staff area, she could hear commotion from elsewhere in the penthouse. Raised voices, phone calls, and the kind of urgent activity that suggested crisis rather than routine business. Margaret moved through the household with increased tension, fielding multiple calls while trying to maintain her usual control over domestic operations. Around noon, the source of the upheaval became clear when Ethan emerged from his office, looking worse than Rosa had ever seen him. His clothes were wrinkled as if he had slept in them, his hair uncombed, his face carrying the gray pallor of someone operating on adrenaline and anxiety rather than rest and nutrition. "Margaret," he called, his voice carrying an edge of panic Rosa had never heard before. "I need you to contact the building management and find out about emergency loan procedures against the penthouse value. The lawyers say the asset freeze might last months longer than we anticipated, and I don't have cash reserves to cover basic expenses." Margaret appeared with the controlled efficiency she maintained during crises, but Rosa could see stress cracks in her usually flawless composure. "The building management indicated that such arrangements require extensive documentation and approval processes," she reported. "They estimated several weeks minimum for preliminary review." "Several weeks?" Ethan's voice rose with something approaching desperation. "I need solutions now, not bureaucratic timelines. Emma's college tuition payment is due next month, Michael's school expenses, the penthouse maintenance fees, insurance premiums. He stopped, seeming to realize that he was revealing financial vulnerability in front of household staff. Rosa continued packing her belongings, but she couldn't help observing the crisis unfolding around her. Ethan was discovering what many people learned during financial emergencies, that wealth on paper didn't translate to available cash, that complex investment portfolios could become burdens rather than resources, that the lifestyle enabled by financial success required constant cash flow to maintain. Margaret's phone rang again, and Rosa could hear her side of a conversation that sounded increasingly desperate. "Yes, I understand that household staff reductions are standard during temporary financial difficulties," Margaret said with forced professionalism. "However, Mr. Whitaker still requires basic domestic services. No, he cannot manage a household of this size without any assistance." Rosa realized that Margaret was discovering her own expendability, that her position as head housekeeper was less secure than she had assumed. The woman who had spent weeks documenting Rosa's inadequacies was now fighting to justify her own continuing employment. When Margaret ended the call, her expression carried the first genuine vulnerability Rosa had seen from her. "The building's concierge service can provide minimal cleaning and maintenance," she reported to Ethan, but they indicated that residents experiencing financial difficulties might want to consider relocating to more manageable accommodations. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke. Ethan's penthouse, which had served as his fortress against the world, was becoming an unsustainable burden. The monthly maintenance fees alone probably exceeded many families' mortgage payments, and without access to his frozen assets, maintaining the lifestyle he had built around wealth was becoming impossible. Rosa finished packing and prepared to say goodbye to a job that had lasted only 3 months, but had taught her volumes about the loneliness that money couldn't cure. As she walked toward the elevator, she paused at the kitchen where she had spent so many hours preparing meals and maintaining the domestic routines that had made the penthouse feel temporarily like a home rather than a display of wealth. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking lost in his own space. "Rosa," he said, seeming surprised to find her there. "Margaret told me, that is, I'm sorry about the circumstances. If the financial situation improves, I would certainly consider." "I understand, Mr. Whitaker," Rosa replied gently. "Sometimes life forces changes we don't expect." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, and Rosa could see that Ethan wanted to say something more, perhaps to acknowledge the conversations they had shared, the moments of genuine connection that had transcended employer-employee boundaries, the comfort she had provided during his darkest hours of crisis. "The rice and beans," he said finally. "I've been thinking about what you said, about learning the difference between what you need and what you want. I'm starting to understand that maybe I've had it backwards for a long time." Rosa smiled with the warmth of someone who recognized growth when she saw it. "Sometimes we have to lose things before we can appreciate what we still have," she said. "Your children, your health, your ability to start over. Those are assets that can't be frozen by federal investigators." Margaret appeared before their conversation could continue further, her expression carrying impatience with what she clearly viewed as inappropriate fraternization between departing staff and her employer. "Rosa, your final payment is ready," Margaret announced with the brisk efficiency that masked her own uncertainty about continued employment. "Mr. Whitaker has calls scheduled throughout the afternoon." Rosa accepted the envelope containing her final paycheck and walked toward the elevator with dignity intact despite circumstances. As the doors opened, she turned back for a final look at the penthouse that had served as both workplace and window into the complicated relationship between wealth and happiness. Ethan stood at the kitchen island where they had shared simple meals and honest conversation, looking like someone beginning to understand that losing everything might be the prerequisite for finding what actually mattered. Margaret hovered nearby with the nervous energy of someone whose own security was less certain than she had assumed. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Whitaker," Rosa said as the elevator doors began to close. "Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. The red line carried Rosa back toward Pilsen through a city that looked the same as it had that morning, but felt different now that she was unemployed again. She calculated her savings, considered job possibilities, and prepared for the familiar process of rebuilding financial security from scratch. But she also carried something valuable from her months in the Whitaker penthouse, the knowledge that she had planted seeds of kindness and wisdom in frozen ground, that she had offered authentic human connection to someone who had forgotten what such connection felt like. Whether those seeds would survive the winter crisis that had descended upon Ethan remained to be seen. But Rosa had learned long ago that the value of planting seeds lay not in guaranteed results, but in the planting itself, in the hope that kindness offered freely might bloom when conditions were right, that patience and dignity might eventually bear fruit in ways that couldn't be predicted or controlled. The train pulled into the 18th Street station, and Rosa emerged into the familiar warmth of her neighborhood, where people knew her name and story, where success was measured in different terms than downtown Chicago's glass towers, where community mattered more than individual wealth. Tomorrow would bring the challenge of finding new employment, but tonight would bring the comfort of home, small but genuine, modest but filled with love, poor by some standards but rich in the ways that actually mattered. 3 weeks passed before Rosa heard from the Whitaker household again, 3 weeks during which she had begun the familiar process of job searching, interviewing, and explaining to potential employers why her most recent position had ended after such a brief period. The Chicago job market in January was particularly challenging, with families reducing household staff after holiday expenses and businesses postponing hiring decisions until spring budgets were finalized. Rosa had interviewed with several families in Lincoln Park and the Gold Coast, but none of the positions felt right. Either the pay was insufficient to meet her basic needs, or the household dynamics reminded her unpleasantly of situations she had escaped in the past. Employers who treated domestic staff like extensions of their appliances, families whose wealth had insulated them from basic human consideration, people who demanded perfection but offered no respect in return. She was beginning to consider taking a position with a commercial cleaning service, working nights in office buildings rather than private homes, when Isabella called with news that complicated her decision-making process. "Mommy, I have something to tell you," Isabella said during their Sunday dinner together, her tone carrying the careful excitement of someone sharing news she hoped would be welcome. "Northwestern offered me a position in their new cardiac unit. It's a promotion, better pay, but it means longer shifts and more demanding schedule." Rosa felt pride and concern in equal measures. Isabella had worked so hard to build her nursing career, and advancement opportunities were precious in a competitive field. But Rosa also understood what demanding schedules meant for young professionals. Less time for personal relationships, increased stress, and the kind of exhaustion that could undermine health and happiness. "That's wonderful, mija," Rosa said, meaning it despite her concerns. "You've earned every opportunity that comes your way." "There's more," Isabella continued. "The position comes with housing benefits. They have apartments near the hospital for staff who work intensive shifts. I could move closer to work, reduce my commute, and—" She paused, looking at her mother with a combination of love and guilt. "And you could think about moving somewhere nicer, somewhere you don't have to worry about making rent if you have gaps between jobs." Rosa understood what her daughter was suggesting, that Isabella's success created opportunities for Rosa to prioritize something other than immediate economic survival, that perhaps she could be more selective about employment opportunities rather than accepting any position that provided necessary income. "I'm proud of you," Rosa said simply, "and I'm grateful, but I'm also not ready to be someone who lives on her daughter's success. I still have work to do, contributions to make." They were discussing Isabella's timeline for the job transition when Rosa's phone rang with a number she didn't immediately recognize. The voice on the other end, however, was unmistakable. "Rosa, this is Ethan Whitaker. I hope I'm not calling at an inappropriate time." Rosa felt surprise and curiosity in equal measures. 3 weeks had passed since her termination from the penthouse, and she had assumed that chapter of her life was closed permanently. "Mr. Whitaker," she replied carefully. "How are you?" There was a long pause, and Rosa could hear background noise that sounded like traffic rather than the quiet luxury of the penthouse. "I'm calling to ask if you might be available to meet for coffee. I have a proposition I'd like to discuss, and I'd prefer to explain it in person rather than over the phone." Rosa agreed to meet the following afternoon at a small cafe near the Loop, curiosity overcoming the caution that warned her against becoming re-involved in the chaos that had characterized her final weeks of employment with the Whitaker family. The cafe Ethan had suggested was modest by downtown standards, a neighborhood place that served real coffee rather than expensive specialty drinks, frequented by office workers and students rather than the wealthy clientele who patronized trendy establishments in the financial district. Rosa found him sitting at a corner table, and she was immediately struck by how much he had changed in just 3 weeks. The expensive suits had been replaced by casual clothes that were well made but unremarkable. Jeans, a sweater, and the kind of winter coat that prioritized warmth over fashion statements. His hair needed cutting, and his face showed signs of weight loss that made his features sharper, but somehow more approachable. Most significantly, his posture had changed from the rigid control she remembered to something more relaxed, as if the burden of maintaining constant perfection had been lifted. "Thank you for coming," he said as Rosa sat down across from him. "I know this must seem strange, calling after everything that happened." Rosa ordered coffee, simple coffee, not the elaborate drink menu items that cost as much as some people's hourly wages, and waited for Ethan to explain why he had requested this meeting. "The asset investigation is ongoing," he began, speaking quietly as if others in the cafe might be interested in his financial troubles. "My lawyers estimate it could take 6 months or longer to resolve completely. In the meantime, I've had to make some significant changes to my lifestyle and living situation." Rosa nodded, understanding that financial crisis often required rapid adjustments that permanently altered people's circumstances. "I sold the penthouse," Ethan continued, and Rosa felt surprise at the speed of such a major decision. "Actually, I'm in the process of selling it. The monthly maintenance costs alone were unsustainable without access to my investment accounts, and I realized that I was maintaining that space more for appearance than for any practical reason." He paused, sipping his coffee, while seeming to organize his thoughts for what came next. "I've rented a house," he said. "A real house in Evanston. 3 bedrooms, normal-sized yard. The kind of place where families actually live instead of where they display their wealth. It needs work, nothing structural, but painting, organization, the kind of domestic attention that makes a house feel like a home." Rosa began to understand where the conversation was heading, but she waited for Ethan to make his request explicitly, rather than assuming his intentions. "I'd like to offer you a position managing this household," he said. "Not just cleaning or cooking, but helping me create a real home. Somewhere my children might actually want to visit, somewhere that feels welcoming rather than intimidating. The pay wouldn't be as much as what wealthy families typically offer, but it would be steady employment with someone who—" He struggled for words. "Someone who understands that home is about more than expensive furniture and perfect cleanliness." Rosa considered the offer carefully. Working for Ethan again would mean returning to a situation that had proven complicated, involving herself with someone whose life remained unsettled by ongoing legal and financial difficulties. But it would also mean working for someone who had been changed by crisis, who might have learned something about what actually mattered during his weeks of forced simplicity. "What happened to Margaret?" Rosa asked, curious about the head housekeeper who had orchestrated her dismissal. Ethan's expression darkened slightly. "Margaret was hired by another family in the Gold Coast," he said. "Someone who could afford her services and appreciated her management style. We discovered during the transition that she had been somewhat creative with household expense reporting, claiming reimbursements for supplies and services that were either overpriced or never actually provided." Rosa felt a moment of vindication, understanding that Margaret's campaign against her had probably been motivated by fear that Rosa would discover discrepancies in household management that Margaret had been concealing. "And the children?" Rosa asked. "How do they feel about all these changes?" Ethan's expression softened with what looked like cautious hope. "That's the surprising part," he said. "When I told them about the financial situation, about having to sell the penthouse and move to a regular house, they seemed relieved." Emma said the penthouse always felt like a hotel, and Michael admitted that he had been intimidated by bringing friends to visit because everything was so formal and expensive. He leaned forward, and Rosa saw excitement in his eyes for the first time since she had known him. "They're planning to visit next weekend, to see the new house and help with some of the organizing. Emma wants to paint her room herself, and Michael is interested in setting up some kind of gaming area in the basement. They're talking about bringing friends over, maybe having people stay for sleepovers. Normal teenage activities that never seemed possible in the penthouse." Rosa understood what Ethan was offering. Not just employment, but a chance to help create the kind of family environment where authentic relationships might flourish, where wealth didn't create barriers between people who loved each other. "The house comes with a small apartment above the garage," Ethan continued. "Nothing elaborate, but private space with a kitchenette and full bathroom. If you were interested, it could be part of your compensation package. You'd have independence, but also proximity to help when needed." Rosa thought about Isabella's upcoming promotion, about the apartment near the hospital, about the possibility of living somewhere safer and more comfortable than her current situation in Pilsen. The offer addressed practical concerns while also appealing to her desire to do work that mattered, to be part of something constructive rather than merely maintaining appearances. "I need to think about it," Rosa said, though she could feel herself inclining toward acceptance. "And I have questions about expectations, responsibilities, the nature of the working relationship." "Of course," Ethan replied. "Would you be willing to see the house? Meet with me again next week to discuss details? I want to be completely transparent about what I'm offering and what I'm hoping for." They spent another hour talking about practical matters, salary, benefits, scheduling, and the realistic timeline for making the Evanston house into a functional family home. Rosa found herself impressed by how much Ethan had changed during their 3 weeks apart. The arrogance and suspicion that had characterized their early interactions had been replaced by humility and openness that made genuine partnership possible. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Ethan turned to Rosa with an expression that combined vulnerability and determination. "I know I don't deserve another chance," he said. "I know I was difficult to work for, and I know Margaret treated you unfairly while I allowed it to happen. But these last few weeks have taught me something important about what kind of life I actually want to live, what kind of father I want to be, and what kind of person I want to become." Rosa recognized sincerity when she heard it, saw the difference between someone offering empty promises and someone who had genuinely learned from difficult experiences. "People deserve second chances when they've earned them," she replied. "Let me see the house, think about everything we've discussed, and I'll give you an answer by the end of the week." As Rosa rode the red line back toward Pilsen, she found herself imagining what it might be like to help create a real home rather than maintaining a wealthy display case. The possibility of steady employment with someone who had learned to value authenticity over appearance was appealing, but more important was the opportunity to do work that mattered, to help heal a family that had been wounded by wealth and isolation, to create a space where children felt welcome and love could grow without the complications of money and pride. That evening, she called Isabella to discuss the offer, knowing that her daughter's perspective would help her make a decision that considered both practical necessities and deeper fulfillment. "He sounds different, Mommy," Isabella said after Rosa had described the conversation. "Like maybe the crisis taught him something important." "That's what I'm hoping," Rosa replied, "but I've been disappointed by employers before. Sometimes people say they've changed when they've just temporarily learned better behavior. The only way to find out is to take the risk Isabella pointed out with the wisdom of someone who had watched her mother navigate difficult employment situations for years. And the worst-case scenario is that you find yourself looking for another job, which is the situation you're in now anyway. Rosa knew her daughter was right, but she also understood that this decision involved more than employment. It was about choosing to invest her care and energy in people who might or might not prove worthy of such investment, about believing that authentic change was possible even for someone whose wealth had insulated him from many of life's essential lessons about humility and gratitude. The following day, Rosa took the train to Evanston to see the house Ethan had rented, curious to understand what kind of space he had chosen for his new life. The neighborhood was tree-lined and quiet, filled with the kind of houses where families actually lived rather than where they displayed their success. The house itself was a 1920s colonial that had been well maintained but showed signs of needing the kind of attention that transformed a house into a home. Ethan met her at the front door, and Rosa could see excitement in his demeanor as he showed her through rooms that were filled with boxes but already felt more welcoming than the penthouse ever had. The living room had a fireplace that looked like it had been used. The kitchen was sized for actual cooking rather than catered events, and the bedrooms were proportioned for human comfort rather than impressive display. The apartment above the garage was indeed small but charming, with windows that looked out over mature trees and space enough for someone who valued privacy without isolation. Rosa could imagine making coffee in the small kitchen, reading in the window seat, and enjoying the kind of independence that came with separate space while remaining available for the work that needed to be done. "What do you think?" Ethan asked as they concluded the tour. Rosa looked around the house, at the boxes waiting to be unpacked, the walls that needed painting, the spaces that required organizing, and saw opportunity rather than overwhelming work. More importantly, she saw the possibility of helping create something meaningful rather than merely maintaining something expensive. "I think it could be a real home," she said simply, "with the right kind of attention and care." Ethan smiled, and Rosa realized it was the first time she had seen him express genuine happiness rather than the calculated satisfaction that came from business success or acquired possessions. "Then you'll consider my offer?" he asked. Rosa nodded, understanding that she had already made her decision during the tour, that some opportunities came disguised as risks, but were actually chances to do the work that mattered most. "I'll need 2 weeks to finish my current commitments and help Isabella with her transition," she said. "But yes, Mr. Whitaker, I'd like to help you build a real home." As Rosa walked back toward the Evanston train station, she carried with her the satisfaction of choosing hope over fear, growth over safety, and the possibility that wounded hearts, both hers and Ethan's, might find healing through the patient work of creating something beautiful from broken pieces. 6 months later, on a warm Saturday morning in June, Rosa stood in the kitchen of the Evanston house preparing breakfast, while listening to sounds that had become as familiar and comforting as her own heartbeat. Emma and Michael arguing good-naturedly about music in the living room, Ethan working in the backyard garden he had started planting in April, and the coffee maker gurgling with the first pot of the day. The transformation of both the house and the family had been gradual but profound. What had begun as a temporary refuge from financial crisis had evolved into something neither Rosa nor Ethan had anticipated, a genuine home where people chose to spend time rather than somewhere they felt obligated to appear. Emma had indeed painted her own room, choosing colors that reflected her personality rather than a decorator's vision of teenage-appropriate decor. Michael had converted the basement into a gaming and entertainment center where his friends gathered regularly, bringing the kind of lively teenage energy that made the house feel alive. Most significantly, both children had begun staying for complete weekends rather than counting hours until they could return to their mother's house. The legal and financial complications that had precipitated Ethan's lifestyle changes were finally resolving. The investigation into David Chen's business practices had cleared Ethan of any wrongdoing. His frozen assets were being gradually released, and his financial situation was stabilizing at a level that would allow comfortable living without the extravagant wealth that had previously defined his lifestyle. But the most remarkable change was in Ethan himself. The suspicious, controlling man who had hired Rosa 9 months earlier had been replaced by someone who had learned to value authenticity over appearance, relationships over possessions, and the simple pleasure of shared meals over expensive entertaining designed to impress people he didn't particularly like. "Rosa," Emma called from the living room, "Michael says you promised to teach us how to make those cookies your grandmother used to make. Can we do that this afternoon?" "If you help with the grocery shopping this morning," Rosa replied, smiling at the easy familiarity that had replaced the formal distance of their early interactions. The apartment above the garage had indeed provided Rosa with the perfect balance of privacy and involvement. She had her own space for reading, prayer, and the quiet reflection that recharged her spirit after days spent caring for others. But she also remained close enough to provide support when needed and to participate in family activities when invited. Isabella, thriving in her new position at Northwestern, visited regularly and had developed an unexpected friendship with Emma, who was considering nursing as a potential college major. The two young women often spent Sunday afternoons discussing career paths and life choices, while Rosa and Ethan worked together in the kitchen, preparing meals that had replaced expensive restaurant dining as the family's preferred way of spending time together. "The financial advisor called yesterday," Ethan told Rosa as he came in from the garden, his hands dirty from planting tomatoes and his face showing the kind of satisfaction that came from physical work rather than stock portfolio performance. "The asset recovery is nearly complete, and it looks like I'll have access to most of my investments within the next month or two." Rosa looked up from the pancake batter she was preparing, curious about what renewed wealth might mean for the life they had built together in Evanston. "And?" she asked, understanding that Ethan's tone suggested the conversation about money included implications beyond simple financial reporting. "And I've been thinking about what kind of life I want to live with that money," Ethan replied. "Not what I can afford to buy, but what's actually worth having." He sat down at the kitchen table where the family had shared hundreds of meals over the past months, watching Rosa cook with the comfortable familiarity of someone who understood that some of life's most important conversations happened during ordinary domestic activities. "I could afford to buy a bigger house," he continued, "something more impressive, with more space and expensive fixtures and all the things I used to think were important. But this house works. The children are happy here. I'm happy here. And changing just because I can afford to change seems like missing the point of everything I've learned this year." Rosa smiled, recognizing wisdom that had been earned through difficult experience rather than simply read in books or heard in lectures. "Money is a tool," she said simply. "The question is what you want to build with it." "I've been thinking about that," Ethan replied, "about what would be worth building." Over breakfast, eaten together at the kitchen table that had become the heart of family communication, Ethan outlined ideas that surprised Rosa with their thoughtfulness and generosity. Rather than returning to the lifestyle of competitive consumption that had characterized his previous wealth, he was considering investments that would create value for others, funding for inner-city educational programs, microloans for small businesses in immigrant communities, and support for job training programs that helped people like Rosa's neighbors in Pilsen develop skills for better-paying employment. "I learned something during those months when my money was frozen," he said. "I learned that wealth only means something if it's connected to purpose, if it's used to create something larger than just personal comfort and security." Emma and Michael listened to these plans with the kind of attention that suggested respect for their father's growth rather than simply polite tolerance of adult conversation. Rosa realized that the children were witnessing their father's transformation from someone who had been shaped by money into someone who was learning to shape money according to his values. "Could we be involved?" Emma asked. "In choosing the programs to support, I mean. I'd like to learn about how to make money do good things instead of just buying expensive stuff." "I was hoping you'd want to be involved," Ethan replied. This is your inheritance we're talking about, ultimately. I'd rather you learned how to be responsible stewards than just wealthy consumers. Rosa felt something she hadn't experienced often during her decades of domestic work: genuine pride in the people she served, satisfaction that went beyond accomplished tasks to encompass being part of something constructive and meaningful. She had helped create not just a comfortable home, but a space where people could grow into better versions of themselves. That afternoon, while Emma and Michael worked with Rosa to prepare cookies that filled the house with scents that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen, Ethan approached her with a conversation that had been building for weeks. "I have something I want to discuss with you," he said, his tone carrying the carefully formal quality that still emerged when he needed to address significant topics. Rosa knew what was coming. With his financial situation stabilizing, Ethan might no longer need the full-time domestic support that had justified her position during the crisis months. She had been preparing mentally for this conversation, calculating her savings and considering what kind of employment she might seek next. "The asset recovery means I can afford to hire more household staff," Ethan continued, "professional cleaning services, catering for when we entertain, the kind of support services that wealthy households typically employ." Rosa nodded, understanding that this was probably the preface to a generous but final severance package. "But I don't want more staff," Ethan said, surprising her. "I want to offer you something different, a permanent position, not as domestic help but as household manager, family coordinator, the person who helps maintain the life we've built here, rather than expanding it into something more complicated." He paused, organizing his thoughts carefully. "This house works because you understand what makes a home rather than just a residence. Emma and Michael are comfortable here because you know how to create space for teenagers to be themselves without judgment. I've learned how to be a real father because you showed me that connection matters more than control." Rosa felt her throat tighten with emotion she hadn't expected. In 30 years of domestic work, no employer had ever acknowledged her contribution in terms that recognized her wisdom and skill rather than simply her labor. "What I'm offering is partnership," Ethan continued, "a salary that reflects the value of what you provide, benefits that include health insurance and retirement planning, and the security of knowing that this is your home for as long as you want it to be." Rosa looked around the kitchen where she had spent so many hours, at the family pictures that now included casual shots of holidays and ordinary moments rather than just formal portraits, at the children who had learned to carry their dishes to the sink and help with meal preparation, not because they were required to, but because they had absorbed Rosa's understanding that caring for shared spaces was everyone's responsibility. "You don't have to answer immediately," Ethan said. "I understand this is a significant decision, and you might want to think about what you want for your own future." Rose smiled, understanding that Ethan was offering something rare and precious: recognition, security, and most importantly, the opportunity to continue work that felt meaningful rather than merely necessary. "I don't need time to think about it," she replied. "This is already my home. These are already my people. What you're offering is the chance to make official what has already become true." As the afternoon sun streamed through kitchen windows, illuminating motes of flour dust from the cookie-making project and highlighting the warm chaos of a family spending Saturday together, Rosa felt the deep satisfaction of seeds planted in frozen ground, finally blooming into something beautiful. Emma emerged from the living room, where she'd been texting friends about weekend plans. "Rosa, can I invite some people over for dinner tomorrow? Nothing fancy, just the spaghetti you make that everyone says is better than restaurant food." "Of course, mija," Rosa replied, the endearment emerging naturally as it had months ago. "How many people?" "Maybe 6 or 7, Emma said. "Is that okay, Dad?" Ethan nodded. And Rosa saw in his expression the satisfaction of a father whose daughter wanted to bring friends home rather than making excuses to avoid family gatherings. Michael appeared from the basement, cookie dough mysteriously decorating his shirt. "Can we have a fire in the backyard tonight? Like, make s'mores and stuff?" "If you help clean up the cookie mess you've apparently distributed throughout the house," Rosa replied with mock sternness that made Michael grin. As evening approached and the family settled into the comfortable routine of shared dinner preparation, Rosa reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this kitchen, this home, this unexpected configuration of people who had learned to love each other authentically rather than conditionally. The wounded millionaire had discovered that healing came through vulnerability rather than control, that connection required showing up as an imperfect person rather than maintaining the facade of having all answers. The humble caretaker had learned that her gift for creating home extended beyond domestic chores to encompass the infinitely more complex work of helping broken hearts remember how to trust and love again. And perhaps most importantly, they had all learned that wealth, whether financial or emotional, only gained meaning when it was shared generously, used to create beautiful things rather than simply accumulated for security or display. As night settled over Evanston and the sounds of family life filled rooms that had been empty just months before, Rosa said a prayer of gratitude for second chances, for the patience to plant seeds in frozen ground, and for the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the most profound victories looked like nothing more than ordinary people choosing to treat each other with kindness, respect, and love. The story that had begun with suspicion, betrayal, and isolation had become something entirely different, a testament to the healing power of authentic connection, the transformative potential of crisis, and the quiet miracle that occurred when people courageously chose to see each other's humanity despite whatever walls money, pride, or past hurt had built between them. And you, have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without saying it out loud? Have you been in a household where your quiet strength helped heal wounds that money couldn't touch? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one reached your heart, leave a like and subscribe so it finds another woman who needs to remember that her work matters, that her dignity is unbreakable, and that kindness planted patiently can bloom in the most unexpected places. For more stories that honor the invisible strength of working women, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this emotional journey with me. I'll see you in the next story where we'll explore again how love grows in the spaces between what we think we deserve and what we dare to hope for.